Growing up, I always loved exploring the abandoned buildings around my small town. They were like time capsules, frozen in moments long gone. One dreary afternoon, I stumbled upon an old asylum that had been closed for decades. The local legends were notorious. They said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered within its walls. But I was feeling brave, perhaps a bit reckless, so I decided to venture inside. The heavy front door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit foyer that smelled of mold and decay. The walls were covered in peeling paint and dark stains, remnants of a violent past. I stepped cautiously inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. As I explored the ground floor, I found remnants of old patient records scattered across the floor, some pages yellowed and brittle. The further I went, the heavier the air felt, as if the weight of the past pressed down on me. I reached the first patient room, its door hanging ajar. Peering inside, I saw a bed stripped of linens, the rusted metal frame creaking softly as if it remembered the weight of countless bodies. I turned to leave but paused as I heard a faint whispering echoing through the halls. It was a soft, pitiful sound, almost like a child crying. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it and followed the sound down the corridor. The walls seemed to close in around me and a cold draft sent shivers down my spine. I approached another room, its door slightly ajar, and peered inside. There in the corner stood a figure, a girl, no older than 10, with hollow eyes and tangled hair. She was dressed in a tattered hospital gown, her skin pale and ghostly. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice barely more than a whisper. Fear gripped me, but I stepped inside, trying to reach out to her. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They won't let me leave," she replied, her gaze shifting nervously toward the dark corners of the room. "They want to keep me here." Before I could respond, the temperature plummeted. The shadows in the room thickened, swirling like smoke. The girl's eyes widened in terror. "You have to go. They're coming." Just then, I heard heavy footsteps approaching, echoing through the hall. Panic surged through me. I backed away, glancing toward the door. "Where do I go?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "Find the exit." "Don't look back," she urged, her voice rising in urgency. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, heavy and relentless, as if something was chasing me. I sprinted down the corridor, the walls closing in, the darkness pressing against my back. I didn't dare look behind me. I could feel their presence, cold and malevolent, clawing at my heels. I burst into the foyer, my breath coming in gasps, and ran for the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness that seemed to breathe around me. With one final push, I flung the door open and stumbled outside into the fading light. The fresh air hit me like a slap, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the street. I glanced back at the asylum, its silhouette looming ominously against the sunset. But the girl's voice lingered in my mind, a haunting echo, "Help me." I never returned to that asylum, but sometimes late at night I can still hear her whispering through the darkness, calling me back to the place where the shadows dwell, where the lost souls wander and time stands still. When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. The place was spacious, with tall ceilings and plenty of light. There was one odd thing, though, a small, narrow closet in the back corner of the bedroom. It looked like it had been wedged in last minute. The paint on the door, slightly different from the rest of the room, the frame a little crooked, but storage was storage, so I ignored it. The first night, I didn't think much about it. I barely glanced at the closet as I went to bed. But around 2 a.m., a strange, scratching sound woke me up. I sat up, my room in darkness, except for a sliver of moonlight slipping through the window. The sound was coming from the closet. It was faint at first, like something small was scraping against the wood from inside. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I eventually fell back asleep, but the sound echoed in my dreams. The next morning, I cautiously opened the closet, half expecting to find something inside. But there was nothing there, just an empty closet with bare wooden walls. Still that night, the scratching started up again, only louder. It was insistent, like something was desperate to get out. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every night, the scratching grew louder and more frantic, echoing through the silent apartment. Sometimes I swore I could hear a faint, muffled voice along with it, a whisper, low and chilling, as if someone was trapped inside. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I stood by the closet door, trembling, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I told myself it was just a mouse or maybe even pipes creaking, but the fear gnawing at me was undeniable. I yanked the door open, shining my flashlight inside, and nothing. The closet was empty. But as I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something strange. The closet seemed deeper than it had before. The back wall looked farther away, almost like the closet was stretching inward, becoming a narrow, dark tunnel. I blinked, thinking I was imagining it, but when I reached my hand in, I felt cold air brushing against my fingertips. That was when I saw something moving in the shadows, deep in the closet. My breath caught as I watched a figure, just barely visible, slinking backward, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were wide, staring at me with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. I slammed the door shut, bolted out of the room, and spent the rest of the night on the couch. The scratching continued, relentless, pounding against the closet door until dawn. The next day I went back into the bedroom, bracing myself for whatever I might find. But when I opened the closet door, the space was back to normal, shallow and empty, with no hint of the tunnel or the figure I'd seen. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it had been a nightmare. That night I locked the closet door and put a heavy chair in front of it, just in case. But it didn't help. Around midnight I heard the lock click open on its own, the sound echoing in the silent room. I sat up in bed, watching as the closet door slowly creaked open, revealing darkness inside. I held my breath, clutching the covers, too terrified to move. And then I saw it. The figure stepped out, crouching low, its limbs long and thin, twisted in unnatural angles. Its face was a blur, but its eyes were sharp, and they were locked right onto me. It crept toward the bed, one slow, shuffling step at a time, the scratching sound following each movement. My heart pounded as it reached the edge of the bed, looming over me. I could feel its cold breath on my face, smell the rancid odor of decay that clung to it. And then in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it said, "I've been waiting all this time for you." I don't remember what happened next. I woke up the next morning on the floor, my body ice cold, my throat hoarse from screaming. The closet door was shut, but I could feel something waiting behind it, watching, listening. I left that apartment the same day. I didn't pack anything, I just left. And since then, I haven't looked at another closet the same way. But every so often, late at night, I hear a faint scratching coming from behind closed doors, and I wonder if it's still looking for me. Well, I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, so I thought. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to take a shortcut through the woods on my way home from a friend's house. The trees towered above me, their bare branches clawing at the sky, and the ground was blanketed in leaves that crunched beneath my feet. As I walked, I noticed a faint glow ahead, flickering like a distant candle. My curiosity piqued, I made my way toward it, weaving through the trees until I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze, inviting me inside. Despite the instinctive warning bells ringing in my head, I stepped in. The air was stale, filled with the smell of damp wood and mildew. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The cabin looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling like ghostly veils. As I explored, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden walls, their meanings lost to time. I felt an unsettling chill creeping down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, drifting through the air. "Stay." I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, rattling the old hinges. Panic surged through me. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back like a taunt. The whisper grew louder, wrapping around me like a fog, urging me to stay. Desperate, I ran to the window, only to find it barred with rusted iron. I could hear footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate, but no one was there when I peered out. My heart raced as I backed away, and that's when I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. I squinted, trying to discern its features, but it remained elusive, its presence suffocating. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, a voice slithering into my ears. "You're ours now." I bolted for the fireplace, hoping to find an exit through the chimney, but the figure moved swiftly, blocking my path. The room began to spin as whispers grew into a cacophony, drowning out my thoughts. "Stay forever." With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the door once more, throwing my weight against it. Miraculously, it flew open and I stumbled outside into the night. But the forest was no longer familiar. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I ran, not looking back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind, growing louder with each step. "You can't escape, you belong to us." Just as I broke through the tree lane and hit the main road, I glanced over my shoulder. The cabin stood silent, but the figure was now standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the road was empty, and my car was nowhere in sight. I felt it then, a cold breeze wrapping around me, pulling me back toward the woods. I fought against it, clawing at the ground, but the whispers were relentless. Stay forever. When dawn finally broke, I found myself on the road, disoriented and shaken, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The cabin was gone, swallowed by the forest, and the whispers faded into silence. But I could still feel their presence, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander too close. It started like any other Halloween. The kind where you're too old for trick-or-treating, but too bored to just stay home and watch horror movies. The kind where someone inevitably suggests doing something stupid for a little adrenaline rush. For us, that something stupid was Briarwood Manor. We'd been talking about it for weeks. The house at the edge of town was infamous, a crumbling old mansion that sat on a hill, its broken windows staring down at the town like hollow eyes. Everyone knew the stories a family had once lived there, the Devereaux, and one day they just vanished. On, no trace. Some said they'd been murdered and their bodies hidden somewhere in the house. Others said they'd been cursed, their spirits trapped inside forever. Either way, no one in their right mind would go near the place. Except for us, apparently. We were bored teenagers looking for a thrill, and the idea of being the first in years to step inside Briarwood was too tempting. I'll admit, it wasn't my idea. It was Ethan who started it. He was always the adventurous one, the guy who'd jump off cliffs into rivers and egg cars on Halloween. So when he suggested we spend the night in Briarwood, of course we laughed it off at first. But then, the more he talked about it, the more it didn't seem like such a bad idea. Plus, he bet us we wouldn't have the guts. So here we were. It was me, Claire, Jenny, and Ethan standing at the foot of the hill, looking up at the mansion. Even from a distance, the place gave off bad vibes. The trees surrounding it were gnarled and twisted, the grass dead and brittle underfoot. The house itself was a mess, windows shattered, roof caving in, walls stained with who knows what. But worst of all was the silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the world is holding its breath. "I don't know about this," Claire muttered, hugging her jacket closer. "This place gives me the creeps." "It's just a house," Ethan shrugged, though I noticed even his voice was quieter now. "We'll go in, take some pics, maybe find some old junk to mess around with, and we'll leave. It'll be fun." "People disappeared here," Jenny whispered, her eyes glued to the mansion. "They never found them. What if the stories are true?" I should have listened to her. I should have listened to my gut, too, because everything about that place screamed, "Stay away." But I didn't. None of us did. "Let's just get it over with," I finally said, forcing a grin. "What's the worst that could happen?" Those were the words that sealed our fate. I just didn't know it at the time. We climbed the hill slowly, the mud sticking to our shoes. Every step closer to the house made my stomach twist into tighter knots. I glanced back at the town below us, the streetlights flickering in the distance. It felt like we were leaving the world behind, stepping into something else, something darker. When we finally reached the front gate, I saw just how bad the place had gotten up close. The iron bars were rusted and bent, the paint peeling off in long strips. Ethan gave the gate a shove, and with a screech that made my teeth ache, it creaked open. Beyond it, the path was overgrown with weeds and brambles, but we pushed through, finally reaching the massive front doors. They were swollen with age, the wood rotting in some places. As we stood there, staring up at the doors, the weight of what we were about to do hit me. "Are we seriously doing this?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. Ethan shot her a grin, but even he seemed a little uneasy. "Come on, don't back out now. We've come this far." I grabbed the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin. It took all my strength to push it open, and when it finally did, the door groaned like it hadn't moved in decades. The smell hit us first like mold, dust, and something rotten. But the worst part? The air inside felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like it was pushing against us. Like it didn't want us there. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The foyer was massive, with a grand staircase leading up into the shadows. Dust covered everything, furniture draped in sheets, portraits on the walls, and the floorboards beneath our feet. It was quiet. Too quiet. "Okay, this is creepy as hell," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible. We all felt it. That sense of being watched. Every creak, every gust of wind through the broken windows made me jump. But we pressed on, deeper into the house, through the darkened hallways that seemed to twist and stretch the farther we went. Then we heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost like it wasn't there at all, but enough to make us stop dead in our tracks. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely a breath. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, soft and distant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "We should go," Jenny said, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't like this." But before any of us could move, something clattered in the room to our left. It sounded like glass shattering. Ethan, of course, had to investigate. "Stay here," he whispered, edging toward the door. I watched as he disappeared into the room, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the walls. Then, nothing. Silence again. Ethan, I called out after a few moments. No answer. My stomach dropped. We all stood there, frozen, waiting for him to come back out. "Ethan, come on." "This isn't funny," Claire shouted. But still nothing. I could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. My skin crawled, and I could swear the shadows in the house were moving. Something was wrong. "We have to go get him," I said, my voice trembling. We stepped toward the doorway, and that's when I saw Ethan's flashlight lying on the floor, still on, but no sign of him anywhere. He was gone. Just gone. And that's when the whispering started again. Louder this time, like a chorus of voices, all around us. "Run," Claire screamed, and we bolted for the front door. But when we reached it, the door that had once creaked open was now slammed shut, and no matter how hard we pulled, it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned to laughter. And then, one by one, the lights from our flashlights started to flicker and die. The darkness swallowed us whole. My breath was ragged, my heart thudding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the faint whispers all around us. We were trapped. The front door wouldn't budge, no matter how much we shoved, pulled, or screamed. And Ethan, he was just gone. 1 second he was there, and then nothing. No footsteps, no scream, no sign of him at all, except for his flashlight lying on the floor. The silence felt alive, like it was breathing down our necks. "What the hell is happening?" Jenny's voice was barely a whisper, her hands trembling as she gripped my arm. "I don't know," I muttered, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. "But we have to find Ethan." The problem was, none of us wanted to go deeper into that house. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to break a window, climb out, do anything but the house. It felt like it wouldn't let us leave. "Maybe there's another way out," Claire suggested, her voice shaky but determined. "A back door, or a window that's still open." "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's check the back. There's got to be something." The three of us crept down the hallway, moving deeper into the house. The further we went, the colder it got, like the temperature was dropping the closer we got to. Something. The walls were lined with dusty portraits, their eyes seeming to follow us as we passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was watching us, hiding in the shadows, waiting. And then we heard it again. A soft shuffling noise coming from the room at the end of the hall. "Ethan," Claire called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "We have to check," I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and run. But we couldn't leave him. Not like this. We approached the door slowly, and when we reached it, I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The hinges creaked, and the door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit room. A large fireplace sat in the center, unlit but still somehow casting an eerie glow across the room, and in the middle of the floor. "Oh my God," Claire gasped. Ethan was there, but he wasn't alone. There, standing just a few feet away from him, was a figure tall, dressed in tattered clothes, its skin a sickly gray. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its hands. long, bony fingers stained red with something that looked far too much like blood. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide and glassy, like he wasn't really seeing us. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, staring ahead. "Ethan," I called out, taking a step forward, but Claire grabbed my arm. "Don't," she hissed, pulling me back. "Something's wrong with him." The figure turned slowly, its head cocking to the side as if it were sizing us up, and then it spoke. But it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, whispering, echoing inside my head. "Leave. But not him. He stays. Forever." The thing took a step toward Ethan, and suddenly he snapped out of whatever trance he was in. His body jerked violently, like he was being pulled by invisible strings, and he screamed a raw, blood-curdling scream that made my skin crawl. "Help me," Ethan screamed, but before we could even move, the thing lunged at him, its fingers wrapping around his throat. His screams were cut off, replaced by a sickening gurgle as the thing lifted him off the ground with impossible strength. We stood there, paralyzed as Ethan's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head. The thing dragged him backward, deeper into the shadows, and before we could even react, they both vanished into the darkness. Gone, just like that. We stood there, staring at the empty space where Ethan had been, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the heart of the Pine Barrens. 5 of us, best friends since high school, were looking forward to 2 days of drinking, hiking, and reminiscing around a campfire. Nothing but the great outdoors and old stories we'd told 1,000 times. No phones, no work, no distractions. The sky was already dark by the time we left the last bit of civilization behind. The only light came from the headlights cutting through the thick, towering trees that lined the narrow dirt road. It felt like we were driving straight into a black tunnel, with only the soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires keeping us grounded. "This place better be worth it," Kim muttered from the back seat, pulling her hoodie tighter around her shoulders. "I swear if this cabin is some rundown shack with no hot water, I'm calling it." "It's not that bad, Alex," my boyfriend said from the driver's seat. He'd been the one who found the place online a deal too good to pass up. It was cheap, isolated, and surrounded by miles of untouched forest. "A perfect getaway," he'd said. "You'll see when we get there. Rustic, sure, but it's all part of the charm." "Rustic is code for falling apart," Kim shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But as long as there's a decent fireplace and something to drink, I won't complain." "Relax," I said, trying to smooth things over. "It's just for 2 days. We'll hike, get some fresh air, and by Sunday you'll be begging to come back." In the back seat, Noah and Jess exchanged a glance. They were the quietest of the group, newly dating and still in that phase where they acted like everything was perfect. Noah, the skeptic, had already voiced his concerns about being this far out in the woods without cell service. But Jess was adventurous, eager to get away from the city, and he'd followed along, albeit with some reluctance. As we rounded a bend in the road, the cabin finally came into view. It was small, nestled among the towering pines like a forgotten relic. The wood siding was weathered, and the single window that faced the road was covered in a layer of grime. The porch sagged slightly, and the only light came from the headlights of our SUV. Charming, Kim deadpanned as Alex parked the car. "Shut up," Alex said, laughing as he turned off the engine. "We're here. Let's make the best of it." We grabbed our bags and stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around us immediately. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distinct scent of pine and damp earth. A strange stillness hung in the air, as though the forest was holding its breath, watching us. "Didn't realize we'd be this far out," Noah muttered, glancing at the dense trees. "No neighbors, huh?" "Nope," Alex said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Just us and nature, peace and quiet." The front door creaked ominously as Alex pushed it open, and we all stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The interior was exactly as described, rustic. A single room with an old stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a creaky-looking set of stairs leading up to a loft. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and definitely no sign of modern conveniences. Just old wooden furniture, dim lighting from a couple of oil lamps, and the pervasive smell of wood smoke. It's like a time capsule, Jess whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the space. Kinda cool. Yeah, cool, Noah muttered. But he was already unpacking, clearly resigned to the situation. Kim dropped her bag on the nearest chair and sighed dramatically. Well, where's the booze? Let's get this party started. Despite the less than ideal accommodations, we managed to make the best of it. Alex lit a fire, the warmth filling the small cabin, while Noah and Jess uncorked a couple of bottles of wine. Kim found an old stereo system, ancient but surprisingly functional, and soon we had music playing softly in the background as we settled in for the night. As the fire crackled and the wine flowed, the tension melted away. We laughed, told stories from our high school days, and marveled at how much had changed since we'd all gone our separate ways. For a while it felt like we were back in time, like nothing had changed. It was after midnight when the first strange noise interrupted our fun. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the creaking of wood under pressure. At first I thought it was just the cabin settling, but then it came again, louder this time, like footsteps on the porch outside. I froze, my glass of wine halfway to my lips. Did anyone else hear that? Hear what Alex asked, looking over at me, his brow furrowed. That. Creaking, I said. It sounded like someone was outside. Kim rolled her eyes. It's probably just the wind or the trees or whatever. We're in the middle of the woods, remember. But Noah was already on edge, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the window. Maybe we should check it out, just in case. Alex shook his head, clearly not concerned. There's nothing out there. Come on, we're miles from anyone. Who'd be creeping around in the middle of nowhere? Bears, Jess offered, her voice light but nervous. I don't think bears creak like that, I said quietly, my unease growing. Reluctantly, Alex stood up and headed for the door, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen counter. Fine, I'll check, if it'll make you guys feel better. He opened the door slowly, the hinges squealing, and stepped onto the porch. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping across the empty front yard, illuminating nothing but the trees swaying gently in the breeze. See? Nothing out here, he called back, his voice tinged with annoyance. But then he paused. The flashlight flickered as if the batteries were dying, casting eerie shadows across the yard. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something movement just beyond the edge of the light, where the trees thickened into darkness. It was gone in an instant, so fast I wasn't even sure if I had really seen it. Let's just lock the door and call it a night, Noah said, his voice tight. Alex stepped back inside, shaking his head. You're all paranoid. It's just the woods. We're safe out here. But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. We decided to turn in for the night. The loft had a couple of old, creaky beds, and there was a couch downstairs. Kim and I took the loft, while the others spread out in the living room below. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room as we all settled in, the sounds of the forest creeping into the silence. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the wind outside, my mind replaying that strange creaking sound over and over. Every now and then, I'd hear the house settle, or the rustle of trees, and I'd stiffen, holding my breath. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not outside this time, but inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, moving across the floor below us. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. I glanced over at Kim, who was sound asleep, completely oblivious to the sound. I wanted to wake her up, but something stopped me. A deep, primal fear. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I lay still, my eyes wide in the dark, waiting, listening. The footsteps started again, this time moving toward the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under the weight of someone or something slowly ascending. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body frozen in place. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the steps came closer and closer and closer, until they stopped just at the top of the stairs. I could feel something standing there watching, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, slowly moving back down the stairs and across the floor. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others what I had heard, expecting them to brush it off like they had the night before. But Noah's face went pale when I described the footsteps. I heard it too, he said quietly, his eyes wide. I thought it was one of you, but when I looked, everyone was asleep. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the cheerful mood of the previous night completely gone. I think we should leave, Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex scoffed, though there was a nervous edge to his laughter. Come on, guys, it's an old house. Of course it makes noise. There's no one out here but us. But none of us were convinced. Not anymore. We packed up quickly, the eerie silence of the woods pressing in on us as we loaded our bags into the car. As we pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't help but glance back at it, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, watching us leave. But the cabin was empty, just as it had been when we arrived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us. Something unseen, something that had been watching us the whole time. As we drove away, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard it again. Footsteps, following us into the woods. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting the desert in hues of orange and crimson. We had been driving for what felt like an eternity, 4 hours at least, with nothing but open road and scrubland in every direction. The highway stretched ahead like an uncoiling serpent, leading us deeper into a wasteland of rock and sand. The air conditioner in my old Toyota was barely keeping up, and a thin layer of sweat clung to my skin. Next time we're flying, Eric groaned from the back seat, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his hoodie. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and the weariness in his voice matched the energy in the car, low and sluggish. I don't care how much the tickets cost. I'd rather sell a kidney than drive through this hell again. Lena, my girlfriend, snorted from the passenger seat, adjusting her sunglasses as she stared out at the desolate landscape. I told you we should have taken the main route. At least there would have been some civilization out there, maybe even a decent motel. She turned to me, her lips curling into a smirk, but knew we had to take your shortcut, which, by the way, hasn't saved us any time. I sighed. She had a point. The so-called shortcut had turned out to be a barren strip of asphalt, devoid of any signs of life. For miles now we hadn't seen another car, let alone a gas station, diner, or anything resembling human presence. The road signs had long faded, and my GPS had lost signal about an hour ago. Relax, I said, forcing a grin. We'll hit a town soon enough. Worst case, we get a killer sunset out of this. Eric groaned dramatically, sinking deeper into his seat. Worst case, we run out of gas, die of dehydration, and the vultures pick at our bones. That's the spirit Lena quipped, though the tension in her voice betrayed her bravado. I could feel the same unease creeping into my chest. The gas needle was inching dangerously close to empty, and the desert felt like it was swallowing us whole. We continued driving as the sun sank lower, turning the desert into a surreal landscape of shadow and light. The last rays of daylight flickered on the horizon, and soon the sky was a deep indigo, studded with stars. The temperature dropped quickly, and a biting wind swept across the road. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, eyes scanning for any sign of life, any hope of fuel or shelter. Finally, up ahead, a faint glimmer of light broke through the dark, a neon sign, flickering like a dying firefly. Thank God, Lena breathed, sitting up straighter. I thought we were doomed for sure. I didn't reply. Something about that sign, about the way it flickered so erratically in the distance, didn't feel right. But we didn't have much choice. We were running on fumes. As we got closer, the sign's words became clearer: last stop gas, open 24 hours. The letters buzzed and hummed, barely holding on, their glow weak and inconsistent. The gas station itself looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned decades ago. The pumps were rusted and covered in dust, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. A single light flickered above the station door, casting a sickly yellow hue over the front. Ugh. This place is a dump, Lena said, wrinkling her nose as we pulled in. It's a gas station, not the Ritz, Eric muttered. Just fill up and let's get out of here. The wind whistled through the cracked windows of the gas station, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes swept the area, but there was nothing. No cars, no signs of life, just the hollow, empty desert stretching out in every direction. I parked next to the pumps, killed the engine, and got out of the car. The air outside was colder than I expected, and it carried the faint scent of something rotting, like decaying wood or spoiled meat. I tried to ignore it, but a pit formed in my stomach as I approached the pump. There was no credit card reader, just an old-fashioned handle that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. "You need me to come with you?" Lena asked, her voice strained. "Nah, it'll be quick," I replied, though part of me wished she'd insisted. I reached for the nozzle, but before I could grab it, something caught my eye movement in the shadows near the side of the building. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing just out of view, half hidden by the station's rusted walls. It was a man, or at least the shape of one. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my hand hovering over the gas pump, watching him. His face was hidden in shadow, and his posture was unnerving rigid, as though he'd been standing there for a very long time. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back. "Hey, let's hurry up," Lena's voice startled me, snapping me out of my daze. She was leaning out of the window, her eyes darting nervously from the gas station to me. "This place is seriously creeping me out." I nodded, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back at the figure. He was gone. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling as I quickly filled the tank. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver down my spine. As soon as the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, I hurried back to the car and jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. "Let's get out of here," I said, starting the engine. Lena was already buckled up, her face pale. "Did you see anyone? I thought I saw someone standing near the building." I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, but he's gone now. Probably just some drifter." Eric leaned forward between the seats, peering out the back window, gone, or watching us drive away. "Can we please not do this right now?" Lena snapped, her voice on edge. "I just want to get out of here." I didn't need any more convincing. I hit the gas, and we sped away from the station, the neon sign flickering in the rearview mirror, until it disappeared into the darkness. For the next few minutes, no one said a word. The desert loomed around us, silent and vast, the sky now a blanket of stars. But the sense of unease didn't leave. It clung to the air like the faint scent of decay that had lingered at the gas station. As the highway stretched ahead, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the car. Eric reached out to adjust it, but before he could, a voice cut through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped." Lena gasped, turning the volume down. What the hell was that? Eric laughed nervously. "Probably just a bad signal, interference or something." But the voice returned, clearer this time, as if it were speaking directly to us. "Where do you think you're going?" I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was cold, deliberate, and filled with an odd sense of malice. "Turn it off," I said, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eric pressed the power button, and the car was plunged back into silence. But the tension inside was palpable. Lena was fidgeting with her seatbelt, her eyes wide as she stared out into the darkness. Then, the car jolted violently. The engine sputtered, and the headlights flickered before cutting out entirely. What the eye slammed the brakes, but the car coasted to a dead stop, the engine silent. We were plunged into complete darkness, the only sound the howling wind and our rapid breathing. No, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again, my heart racing. Still nothing. "Dude, what's happening?" Eric's voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, trying to hide the panic that was clawing at my throat. Lena fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. No service. Of course. "Great," Eric muttered, glancing out the window. "We're stuck in the middle of nowhere." I sat back in my seat, staring out at the endless stretch of blackness. The desert was still, but there was a weight in the air, a feeling that we weren't alone. My pulse quickened, and I had the sudden terrifying sense that something was watching us. Then I saw them. Shapes, just beyond the reach of the dim starlight, moving toward the car. At first, they were nothing more than shadows, but as they drew closer, their outlines became clearer figures, human-like but wrong, shambling toward us in slow, deliberate steps. "There's someone out there," Lena whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Eric leaned forward, squinting into the dark. "Who the hell?" I cut him off, my voice tight with fear. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The figures were closing in, their movements slow and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but their eyes, those glowing, hungry eyes, bored into us. We were trapped. And we weren't alone anymore. Back when I was in my early 20s, I attended Arizona State University, and any chance I got, I'd make the 5.5-hour drive back home to San Diego. It wasn't the easiest trip, especially when I was juggling school and work, but the thought of being back with family and my old friends made the long hours on the road worth it. There were weekends where I'd get so homesick, I'd hop in my car late on a Friday night, drive through the night, just to spend less than 48 hours at home, and then head right back to Arizona by Sunday evening. I got really used to driving at night when the roads were quieter, and it felt like I had the entire highway to myself. One week, though, I got a call that was different from my usual "how's school going" or "do you need anything" kind of conversation. It was my mom. She sounded stressed and a little frantic. My grandpa had been rushed to the hospital, and it didn't look good. He had been sick for a while, but things had taken a serious turn. She didn't outright say it, but the message was clear: I needed to come home. It might be my last chance to see him. It was 11:30 at night when I got the call. Without a second thought, I grabbed my backpack, threw in some clothes, a toothbrush, and whatever else I could think of in the moment. I quickly told my roommate what was going on, and that I'd be gone for a few days. Then I hit the road. A few hours into the drive, somewhere in the middle of rural Nevada, I started to feel that exhaustion that only kicks in during the dead of night. You know, that eerie stillness when everything's too quiet and all you can hear is the hum of your engine and the occasional bump from the road beneath your tires. I had been driving this route for years, so I knew all the little stops where I could pull over, stretch my legs, and grab a coffee to help me push through. There was one stop in particular I always hit just about an hour before crossing into California. It was my little routine, my last chance to mentally prepare myself before heading into my home state. Here's the thing: back when I was living in Arizona, I carried. I had my concealed carry permit, and I felt a little safer knowing I had something to protect myself with, especially since I spent so many hours driving alone at night, through mostly deserted roads. But once I crossed into California, the laws were different. My permit didn't mean anything there, so every time I got close to the border, I'd pull over, park my car, and take the time to disassemble my gun and lock it away to be in compliance with California's gun laws. It was a habit I never skipped. That night was no different. I parked at my usual spot, started breaking down my gun, and then locked everything up safely. After that, I stepped out of my car to head into the gas station for a quick bathroom break, and of course some caffeine to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. But just as I'm walking past my truck, something feels off. You know that gut feeling, like the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the darkness and fatigue playing tricks on me. But then, out of nowhere, I feel this strong arm wrap around me from behind. My heart practically stopped. I let out the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I could muster, hoping against hope that anyone might hear me. But I knew, deep down, that there probably wasn't anyone around. The gas station was practically empty, and the road was dead quiet. Still, I screamed, and I fought. I kicked backward, trying to hit the guy who had me in a chokehold, but he was stronger than me. He lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing, making it impossible for me to get any real leverage to fight back. I tried to twist and break free, but he just bent me over, keeping me locked in his grip, and that's when pure terror set in. My mind was racing. I thought, this is it. This is how I go, and just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard the screech of tires behind me. My fear spiked, thinking the guy had a partner, that they were going to throw me into the back of a truck and drive off, never to be seen again. But to my surprise, it wasn't the nightmare scenario I had envisioned. The screeching tires belonged to an old Toyota Corolla, and out of nowhere, 4 teenagers jumped out of the car. To this day, I have no idea why those kids were at that gas station at such a late hour, but I thank every star in the sky that they were. They ran toward me and the guy, and in the split second it took for them to get close, the creep let go of me and bolted. 2 of the boys chased him into the desert behind the gas station, while the other 2 stayed with me. I was shaking, gasping for air, and in complete shock, but they stayed with me, calming me down and making sure I was okay. One of them even went inside to grab me a cup of coffee, and the other handed me a cigarette. Now, I didn't even smoke, but in that moment, I took the cigarette without hesitation, desperate for anything to calm my nerves. They stayed with me until the cops arrived, and I told them everything that had happened. The guy who attacked me had vanished into the desert, and despite their best efforts, the police never found him. For years after that night, I would text those boys on the anniversary of the incident, just to say thank you. I can't count how many times I replayed that night in my head, wondering what would have happened if they hadn't pulled into that gas station. What if they had decided to turn a blind eye and kept driving? I could have been another statistic, another missing person whose story ends in tragedy. But instead, they stopped. They saved my life. I lost the phone I had saved their numbers on, so I don't send those texts anymore, but I'll never forget them. They chose to be heroes that night, something that not everyone would do. Because for every person who steps up and helps, there are just as many who would pretend they didn't see a thing. I haven't slept in what feels like weeks. Every night the same terror unfolds. The same unrelenting, gut-wrenching terror that I can't shake off. The story I'm about to tell you, it's something that's been haunting me. And if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Because maybe once you hear this, it'll start happening to you too. It started a few months ago, simple at first. Bad dreams. Nightmares like anyone would have after a long day. I didn't think much of them. Who doesn't have a bad dream here and there? But the thing is, these nightmares weren't just nightmares. It was like someone had found a way to break into my brain, twist the knife deep into the darkest part of me, and pull. The dreams didn't make any sense at first. Random images. Voices that didn't seem to belong to anyone I knew. But they felt ancient, old, like they were coming from another time, another world. At first, I convinced myself it was stress. Work had been brutal. My relationship was falling apart. My dad was in the hospital, and I was barely keeping myself together. So, yeah, of course I'd have some bad dreams. But then, they got worse. Much worse. The first real dream started on a Wednesday. I remember because I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the scream still lodged in my throat. In that dream, I wasn't myself. I was someone else, in another time, another place. And I was dying. I was standing in the middle of a dense forest, the air thick with the stench of decay. There were trees towering above me, their branches hanging low, almost like skeletal hands reaching out to grab me. The ground was wet, like it had rained for days. My feet sank into the mud as I walked, the air heavy with the sound of distant chanting. I wasn't alone. There were people in front of me, dozens, maybe more. Their faces were covered by strange, carved masks, primitive-looking, almost tribal. They were all gathered in a circle, murmuring something I couldn't understand, their voices low, rhythmic, like a prayer. In the center of the circle was a stone altar, rough and uneven, stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. I tried to turn around to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My feet were frozen to the spot. And then I saw her, a woman, her body bruised and broken, tied to the altar with thick ropes. Her chest was heaving, her breath shallow, and her eyes. God, her eyes were filled with terror. I knew what was going to happen before it did. One of the figures stepped forward, holding a crude stone knife, the blade chipped and jagged. He raised it high above his head, the chanting growing louder, faster, more frenzied. And then, in one swift motion, he brought it down. I felt the blade tear through her flesh. I felt it like it was happening to me. Her scream echoed through the forest, a sound so raw, so primal, it sent a shock of terror straight through my bones. and as her blood spilled onto the altar, soaking the stone, I realized something. She wasn't just dying. She was cursing me. Her eyes locked onto mine, her mouth moving silently, and I could hear her voice in my head. "This is your fault. You did this to me. You will suffer for it." I woke up screaming, my body shaking uncontrollably, the sound of her voice still ringing in my ears. I told myself it was just a nightmare, just a random, awful dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too real, like I had actually been there, in that forest, watching her die. And worse, like she knew me. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Every single night I found myself in a different place, a different body, experiencing someone's death in the most horrific, gut-wrenching way possible. It was like I was being forced to relive the final moments of people who had died thousands of years ago, people who had suffered unspeakable fates, all while knowing it was somehow my fault. There was the man who was burned alive by his own village, tied to a wooden post as the flames consumed him, his screams filling the air as his skin blistered and blackened. His eyes met mine as the fire crawled up his body, and he whispered through the smoke, "You did this to me." There was the woman who was stoned to death by a mob, each rock crashing against her body with sickening thuds, her blood splattering the ground. With every strike, she glared at me through the chaos, her broken mouth forming the words, "You let them do this." And then there was the child no older than 10 who drowned in a river, her tiny hands clawing at the water as she struggled to breathe, her face pale and cold as the current dragged her under. In her final moments, her eyes found mine, her lips moving as she mouthed, "You could have saved me." Every night, a new death. Every night, a new accusation. It was always my fault. At first, I tried to tell people, my friends, my girlfriend, even my therapist. I told them about the dreams, about how real they felt, how I could feel their pain, hear their voices, even after I woke up. But no one believed me. "Stress," they said. "You're overworked, it's just your mind playing tricks on you." Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something else, something bigger. The worst part? Every time I woke up, I felt weaker, more drained, like the life was being sucked out of me. I started avoiding sleep, but it didn't matter. The dreams would come for me anyway, pulling me into their world, into their suffering, night after night after night. I began to see things during the day, two shadows moving in the corners of my vision, faint whispers in the wind that no one else could hear. I'd catch glimpses of the people from my dreams, those who had died standing in the distance, watching me with their accusing eyes. They never came closer, but they were always there, waiting. And then one night it changed. I found myself standing in a vast, open field. The sky was dark, filled with swirling storm clouds, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. In the distance, I saw them, hundreds of them. The people from my dreams, all of them, standing in a line, their eyes fixed on me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped, as they began to march toward me, their footsteps echoing across the field. As they drew closer, I could see the horror etched into their faces, the burns, the bruises, the blood. Their bodies were broken, twisted, mutilated in ways I can't even describe, and yet their eyes never wavered. "You did this," they chanted, their voices merging into one deafening roar. "You caused this. You will suffer as we have suffered." They were so close now, so close I could feel their cold breath on my skin, smell the rot and decay of their bodies. And then, just as they reached me, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, like a knife being driven straight through my heart. I looked down, and there it was, buried deep in my flesh, blood pouring from the wound. I screamed. And that's when I woke up. But the pain didn't go away. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it, the burning, stabbing sensation in my chest. It hasn't stopped since that night. It's like the wound followed me out of the dream, a constant reminder that I can't escape this, that I'll never escape this. I don't know how much longer I can take it. Every night, they come for me. Every night, they die again and again, and they make sure I know it's all my fault. And one day, I know they're going to take me with them. The nightmares. They haven't stopped. Every night, without fail, I'm thrown back into the past, into some twisted version of ancient horrors. I've witnessed plagues sweeping through cities, watching as men, women, and children wither away, their bodies rotting while they're still alive. I felt the searing pain of arrows piercing my flesh during battles I know nothing about, in lands that I could never identify. I've been flayed alive, each strip of skin peeled from my body while I screamed until my voice gave out. But even worse than the deaths themselves are the accusations that follow. They blame me. Each one of them. It's always my fault. They scream at me, cry, beg, and curse my name. And the worst part? I'm starting to believe them. It's not just the nights anymore. The waking hours are becoming a living hell too. I see them everywhere I go now, lurking in the periphery of my vision, their hollow eyes tracking my every move. In the shower, I see their distorted faces in the mist on the mirror. In the street, I feel their cold hands brush against my skin. I can't walk anywhere without hearing faint whispers following me, voices calling me a murderer, a coward, a betrayer. It's all around me, there's no escape. I've tried everything: medication, therapy, meditation, even some of that new age crap people talk about. Nothing works. I've even resorted to staying awake for days at a time, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if I don't sleep, the dreams won't find me. But they do. The moment I close my eyes, even for a second, they're there, waiting. And when I don't sleep, they come during the day, haunting my every breath. The faces of the dead flash in front of me, their mangled bodies etched in my mind like some horrific slideshow on repeat. Their words never stop, their screams never fade. I'm drowning in guilt. But guilt for what? I don't know these people. I've never seen them before, never hurt anyone in my life, yet they act like I'm responsible for every horrific thing that's ever happened to them. I'm starting to question my sanity. Did I do something in another life, maybe? Have I been cursed? Did I commit some ancient sin I can't remember? Or am I just losing my mind? Last week I went to see someone about it. Not a therapist, a medium. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but I was desperate. She was this old woman, sitting in a dark room full of crystals and candles, the kind of place you'd think was a joke. But when I sat down in front of her, when she took my hand and looked into my eyes, the smile vanished from her face. She knew.